Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we're going to be diving deep into how trauma can actually leave a lasting impact on the mind, the brain, and even the body.
Okay.
You sent us some really interesting stuff about PTSD and the work of Dr. Bessel Kolk,
Yes.
specifically his book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like you're really wanting to understand those long-term effects of trauma, even years, maybe even decades
Mm-hmm.
after the actual event.
Right.
So get ready because we're going to uncover some pretty fascinating insights
Mm.
as we kind of take a journey into how our brains actually function under extreme stress.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how I think oftentimes, we just associate trauma with maybe soldiers or like these really extreme events.
Right.
But what Dr. Kolk reveals in his book is that it's way more widespread.
Absolutely. And he throws out some pretty startling numbers in The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
Like, did you know that 1 in 5 Americans have actually experienced sexual molestation as a child?
Well,
And then 1 in 4 have been physically abused by a parent.
it's a lot.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
And these figures really paint a pretty stark picture.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma isn't just confined to war zones or these like really extreme events. It actually permeates families, relationships, just like everyday life.
Yeah, for sure.
What are your thoughts on these statistics? Like, do they challenge any preconceived notions you might have had about trauma?
Yeah, they definitely highlight the pervasiveness of trauma. It's everywhere. And I
Wow.
think it's something that we don't talk about a lot.
Yeah.
And, Dr. Kolk emphasizes how these effects of trauma linger. They don't just go away. They often resurface as PTSD. And one of the things I thought was really interesting in the book was
Yeah.
he talks about this compelling story about Tom, a Vietnam veteran who's grappling with, the war's aftermath.
Yeah.
And he's haunted by nightmares, flashbacks.
Oh, wow.
He feels emotionally numb and he's unable to connect with his family.
That's incredibly powerful and heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Tom's story really illustrates how trauma's grip can just persist long after the actual events
Absolutely.
themselves have happened.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, have you ever felt triggered by something or struggled to shake off a past experience without really understanding why?
Right.
Maybe there's a connection there to some unresolved trauma.
Yeah, that's a great question for our listeners to kind of reflect on.
Yeah.
Because I think oftentimes, we have these things that happen to us and we kind of just try to push them under the rug and not think about them.
Exactly.
But, they really do have a lasting impact.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Kolk really gets at in The Body Keeps the Score is this idea that trauma isn't just a mental or an emotional ordeal.
Right.
It actually physically alters the brain and the body.
Yeah, it changes the physiology.
Obviously.
It's not just something that happens in your mind.
This is where things get really interesting because he goes on to explain how trauma can disrupt things like your sleep, your appetite, your ability to experience touch,
Mm-hmm.
and then it can even affect things like the immune system.
Wow.
It's not just about willpower or some sort of character flaw.
Right.
It's actually about those physiological changes that are triggered by the trauma.
Yeah. So to understand that a little bit better, I think it's helpful to kind of take a look at, the brain's anatomy
Okay.
and specifically those areas that are involved in the stress response.
Okay.
So Kolk kind of breaks it down into 3 key parts: the reptilian brain, or the brainstem, the limbic system,
Okay.
and the frontal lobes.
Okay. So the reptilian brain, that's our primal brain.
Right.
And it's responsible for all those like survival functions, like
Mm-hmm.
breathing, heart rate, that sleep-wake cycle.
Yep.
Okay, got it. But what about those other parts? How do they kind of come into play when we're talking about the stress response?
Well, the limbic system.
Yep.
So that's all about emotions and threat detection.
Yeah, okay.
And it houses this little thing called the amygdala, which Kolk refers to as the brain's smoke detector.
Right.
So you can imagine it as like a super, super sensitive alarm system that's constantly on,
Okay.
and it's instantly triggered by any sign of danger.
Okay, I see.
So have you ever felt that sudden, jolt of anxiety when you're in, what seems like a totally safe situation?
Yeah.
That's your amygdala firing.
Ah, so it's kind of like that feeling when you think you see a spider out of the corner of your eye and your heart just skips a beat,
Right.
even before you can even process what's happening.
Exactly, yeah. So your body's already reacting before your mind even knows what's going on.
Wow.
And then we have the frontal lobes, so that's our thinking brain.
Okay.
And that's responsible for planning, decision-making, impulse control, all those higher level functions.
Right.
And the prefrontal cortex, which is right at the very front, acts like a watchtower. So it's trying to kind of make sense of all the signals that are coming from the amygdala
Okay.
and decide, what the best course of action is.
That makes sense. So when it comes to flashbacks, Kolk did some brain scan studies that revealed something really remarkable.
Yeah.
During a flashback, the brain is essentially reliving the trauma as if it's happening in the present moment.
Right.
And I can't imagine how terrifying that must be.
Oh, absolutely. And he discusses this woman, Marcia,
You?
who had been traumatized by a car accident where her daughter died.
Oh, God.
And they had her listen to like a script that described the accident while she was in the brain scanner. And what they found was that her amygdala, that fear center, just lit up.
Oh, wow.
It was going crazy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the activity decreased in another area called Broca's area, which is the speech center.
So it's almost as if, like, the trauma is actually hijacking the brain,
Yes.
making it incredibly difficult to articulate the experience.
Yeah. You can't even put it into words.
It's like that quote from journalist Ed Murrow.
Yes.
After witnessing the liberation of Buchenwald, he said, "For most of it, I have no words."
Powerful, yeah.
It's very powerful.
Yeah, and I think those findings really shed light on why some experiences are just so hard for us to put into words.
Right.
Because the trauma just overwhelms the brain's capacity to process what's happened.
Yeah.
And to integrate that experience into a coherent narrative.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Have you ever had an experience that was so overwhelming, so intense, that you literally just couldn't find the words?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I think we all have.
It's like your brain just kind of shuts down.
Right.
It's like a protective mechanism.
It is.
Yeah.
Like I can't even.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what trauma does. It just overwhelms our system in a way that we can't even begin to process it sometimes.
It's true.
And that's why it's so important to understand these underlying mechanisms, right?
Absolutely.
So that we can start to find ways to heal and to move forward.
Right. It's wild how trauma can just leave you speechless.
Yeah.
Like you just can't even.
Right.
And another key concept in The Body Keeps the Score is this idea of dissociation.
Okay.
It's basically a coping mechanism where the mind kind of detaches from the body to survive these really overwhelming experiences.
So it's like the mind is checking out when things just get too intense.
Exactly, yeah. It's like a way to protect yourself.
Right.
And Kolk, he uses these brain scans of Stan and Uta, who were both involved in this horrific car accident.
Okay.
And he uses it to kind of illustrate dissociation.
Okay.
And Stan's scan, it showed all this intense activity,
Oh, wow.
which indicated he was reliving the trauma.
Oh, gosh.
But Uta's scan, it showed decreased activity,
Oh, wow.
which suggests she had kind of gone numb.
So it's almost like their brains responded in completely opposite ways.
It is, and I think it's so fascinating that, the same event can lead to such different responses.
Absolutely. It's like everyone copes differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And both responses are totally valid.
Right.
It's not about being strong or weak.
It's just your brain's way of protecting you.
It is, yeah. It's a testament to that plasticity of the brain.
Yeah.
How it can adapt to these extreme situations in different ways.
Have you ever, felt that feeling of being spaced out?
Oh, yeah.
Or, detached during a really stressful time?
All the time.
Yeah.
And you know what? That might have been your brain's way of protecting you through dissociation.
That's a really insightful way to think about it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Kolk also delves into this idea of learned helplessness
Yes.
that he observed in animals who were subjected to these inescapable shocks.
Mm-hmm.
And these animals would eventually just give up trying to escape, even when it was possible.
Right. They just learned that there was no point in trying.
It's so heartbreaking.
It is.
It's like a very powerful analogy for the human experience of trauma.
Yeah, that feeling of being trapped and powerless.
Right. And it can linger even after the danger is past.
Exactly. And it can really impact your ability to move on with your life.
Right. And this makes me think about Kolk's emphasis on physical movement for healing.
Yes.
It's like the body needs to learn that it can escape, that it has the power to act and protect itself.
I agree. It's about reclaiming that sense of agency.
Do you think this might explain why activities like running or dancing can feel so liberating, especially during times of stress?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I think you've hit on something really important there.
It's like you're literally moving your body out of that stuck place.
Yeah, and it's sending a message to your brain that you're not helpless.
That you're not trapped.
Exactly.
It's amazing how connected the mind and body really are.
It is.
And this brings us to a really crucial point that van der Kolk makes.
Okay.
Talk therapy, while valuable, often isn't enough to heal those deep-rooted effects of trauma.
Right. It can only take you so far.
And he also points out the limitations of medication.
Yeah, it can be a Band-Aid, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem.
Right. It might help manage the symptoms, but it doesn't address the root cause.
It's like putting a bandage on a broken bone.
Exactly.
It might make you feel a little better temporarily, but it's not going to heal the bone.
So what does he suggest instead?
Well, he dives into a range of body-based therapies that have shown a lot of promise in helping people reconnect with their bodies and restore that sense of safety and control.
That's really intriguing.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so one that he's a big proponent of is yoga.
Okay.
And, it makes sense because with its focus on the breath, movement, and body awareness, yoga can be incredibly helpful in regulating that nervous system and calming that stress response.
Right. And it's often touted for its calming effects.
Exactly.
What about something like EMDR?
Ah, yes, EMDR. So that stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
It's a mouthful.
It is, yeah.
But I've heard it can be really effective for PTSD.
It can, yeah.
But how does it work?
Well, it uses bilateral stimulation, so things like eye movements or tapping.
Okay.
And this helps the brain process and integrate those traumatic memories.
So it's like retraining the brain to respond differently to those memories.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's shown like really remarkable results.
It has, yeah, in reducing those PTSD symptoms.
That's amazing.
And then there's neurofeedback.
Oh, yeah, neurofeedback.
It sounds so futuristic, right?
It does.
But basically, it allows you to see your brainwave activity in real time.
Wow.
And then you can learn to regulate it.
So it's like having a window into your own brain.
It is, yeah.
That's incredible.
And it gives you the power to kind of take control of your mental state.
It's amazing to think that we can train our brains to be calmer and more resilient.
I know, it's pretty cool.
What I find really compelling about van der Kolk's approach is that he doesn't advocate for just one specific therapy.
Right.
He seems to really emphasize a holistic approach, recognizing that interconnectedness of mind, brain, and body.
He sees the whole picture.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think what's really refreshing about his book is that it doesn't offer a quick fix.
Right.
It's not like, do these 3 things and you'll be cured.
Exactly.
It really delves into those complexities of trauma and those many pathways to recovery.
Right, because everyone's journey is different.
It is, yeah, and it encourages us to kind of explore what works best for each individual.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, you shared some fascinating excerpts from some of Dr. van der Kolk's lectures.
Yes.
Where he talks about the role of perception and imagination in trauma.
Right.
Particularly his work with Vietnam veterans and a study involving the Rorschach test, those ink blot images.
Yes, that's a classic.
So tell me about that study. What did it show?
Well, it basically showed how trauma can shape our perception of the world.
Okay.
And, a lot of the veterans, when shown those Rorschach cards, they saw images of violence and bloodshed. It was as if their trauma was coloring their interpretation of these ambiguous shapes.
That's so interesting.
It is, yeah, and it makes you wonder how much of what we perceive is influenced by our past experiences.
Right, especially those that we might not even be consciously aware of.
Exactly.
It's like our subconscious is always working in the background.
It is, and in the case of these veterans, their trauma had basically become a lens through which they viewed everything.
Right, and that inability to separate the past from the present, that's a real hallmark of PTSD.
It is, yeah. It's like they're constantly reliving those experiences.
But there's another side to this, right?
Yes.
Dr. van der Kolk also talks about how trauma can stifle imagination.
Right.
Which is the very thing that allows us to envision new possibilities.
Yeah, to move beyond the past.
Exactly.
It's so important for healing and growth.
And trauma can sometimes trap people in that cycle of reliving their pain.
Yeah, it's like they get stuck.
And it makes it hard to break free.
Absolutely, and that's where those body-based therapies can be so helpful.
Because they help to bring you back into the present moment.
Yes, into your body.
Yeah.
And out of your head.
And then there's this rather unsettling concept he brings up.
Okay.
This idea of being addicted to trauma.
Yeah, that one's tough to wrap your head around.
It is.
That's real.
He suggests that some people are actually drawn to situations that trigger their trauma. Almost like seeking out pain.
Right, and it seems so counterintuitive.
It does. How could someone be drawn to pain?
Well, van der Kolk explains that our brains release these endorphins, which are like natural painkillers.
Right.
And they're released in response to stress and pain.
Okay.
And so this can create this paradoxical pleasure,
Wow.
this sense of relief or even euphoria.
Really?
Yeah, that gets associated with that traumatic experience.
So it's like the body's attempt to cope with overwhelming stress,
Exactly.
but it can lead to this dangerous cycle of seeking out trauma.
Yeah, to trigger those endorphins.
Oh gosh, that's almost like the saying, sometimes the cure is worse than the disease.
That's a perfect analogy.
And this can manifest in different ways,
I can, yeah.
like from self-harm to repeatedly engaging in risky behaviors or relationships.
Right, it can be anything that triggers that same rush of endorphins.
It really underscores that healing from trauma is a journey,
Mm-hmm.
and it's often a long and winding one
It is.
that requires a deep understanding of its impact on the brain and body.
And a lot of patience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And self-compassion.
Yeah.
It's because it's not a linear process.
No, it's
There are going to be ups and downs.
then setbacks.
Yes, but with the right support and those therapeutic approaches,
Yeah.
it's definitely possible to move towards healing.
And to reclaim that sense of agency and well-being.
Absolutely.
Now, let's shift our focus to the medical field's traditional approach to trauma.
Okay.
Yeah, you shared some really insightful excerpts from Kolk's lectures,
Yeah.
specifically his early experiences as a young psychiatrist in the 1970s.
Right.
And he mentions how back then there wasn't even a diagnosis for PTSD.
I know, it's hard to believe, right?
It is, and the medical community often misdiagnosed or dismissed trauma symptoms.
Yeah, it was often seen as a weakness or a character flaw.
Imagine going through something so life-altering
I know.
and then being told it's all in your head.
That must have been so invalidating.
It's just heartbreaking.
It is, and it makes Kolk's work even more significant.
Right. He was instrumental in bringing trauma to the forefront of medical awareness,
He was a true pioneer.
challenging those prevailing assumptions about mental illness
Mm-hmm.
and advocating for a more nuanced understanding of how trauma actually affects us.
And he tells this really powerful story about a veteran named Tom
Okay.
who refused medication for his nightmares.
Oh, wow. Why?
Because he felt like it would be betraying his fallen comrades.
Oh, wow.
And I think that really highlights that healing isn't just about fixing a chemical imbalance.
Right. It's about acknowledging those deeper emotional wounds
Exactly.
and finding ways to process those experiences.
Yeah, and it's about respecting each individual's experience.
Right. Their unique way of coping.
And finding approaches that resonate with their values and beliefs.
Absolutely.
Because what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly.
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, it's not.
And I think that's something that Kolk really emphasizes throughout his work.
Yeah, and now let's delve a little deeper into some of the more technical aspects of his work,
Okay.
particularly his brain imaging studies with trauma survivors.
Yes, those are fascinating.
You know, he compared the brain scans of two individuals,
Mm-hmm.
Stan and Uda,
Yeah.
who had both experienced the same horrific car accident.
Right, and this study provided some really striking evidence of how trauma can manifest differently in the brain.
Tell me more about that.
So Stan, who relived the trauma through flashbacks,
Yeah.
showed really intense activity in his amygdala, that fear center.
So his brain was essentially stuck in that fight or flight mode.
Exactly, even years after the accident.
Wow.
And then Uta, who dissociated, showed decreased overall brain activity.
So it was almost like her brain had shut down to protect itself.
Right, like it was overwhelmed and needed to go offline.
That's incredible. The same event, but two completely different neurological responses.
It is, and it highlights the importance of personalized treatment.
Right, there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. And Kolk really stresses understanding how trauma impacts the brain's emotional and impulse regulation.
Okay.
And he introduces this concept of top-down versus bottom-up regulation.
I found that really helpful. Can you explain it for our listener?
Yeah, so top-down regulation strengthens the prefrontal cortex, that thinking brain,
Okay.
so it can better control the amygdala, the emotional brain.
So it's like training your rational mind to take the reins from your emotional responses.
Exactly. And techniques like mindfulness meditation and cognitive behavioral therapy can help with that.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
And then bottom-up regulation focuses on calming the nervous system
Okay.
through those body-centered techniques like breath work, yoga, somatic experiencing.
Ah, so working directly with the body's stress response system.
Right, and finding a balance between these two approaches, I think, is key to regaining that sense of safety and control after trauma.
It's like giving your brain and body the tools they need to work together
Exactly.
and to heal.
Mm-hmm.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to touch on one final and incredibly important point that Kolk makes,
Okay.
the role of social connection and support in healing.
Yes, that's huge.
He argues that trauma often leads to isolation and disconnection,
It does, yeah. It can really make you feel alone.
but rebuilding those bonds is crucial for recovery.
Absolutely, because finding those supportive relationships, whether it's with friends, family, a therapist, or a support group, can be incredibly healing.
Right, it's like a reminder that you're not alone in this,
Hmm.
and it helps to rebuild that sense of belonging and connection,
It does, yeah, and it reminds you that you're worthy of love and support.
and that's so important.
It is, yeah, and I think it's something that we often forget when we're going through something difficult.
We tend to isolate ourselves.
We do, yeah. But connecting with others is so crucial for healing.
There's something so powerful about knowing that you're not alone,
Absolutely.
especially when navigating the complex aftermath of trauma.
It's like having a lifeline.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It really is. And it kind of brings us back to that point you made earlier about trauma really shattering our trust and safety in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that can make it so difficult to really connect with people.
Right, exactly.
So finding those supportive relationships, be it with friends or family or a therapist or even a support group,
Yeah,
can be incredibly healing.
it is. Yeah, those connections can really make all the difference.
Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into trauma and the brain, I want to circle back to one more aspect of Dr. Kolk's work that you highlighted in your sources,
Okay.
specifically his groundbreaking research at the Boston Veterans Administration Clinic.
Yeah, that was really fascinating stuff.
It's amazing how he was really at the forefront of understanding how trauma was affecting veterans, especially during a time when awareness and effective treatments were really lacking.
Right. It was a very different time back
I
then.
mean, can you imagine?
I know.
Like in one of his lectures, he talks about how at the time there was very little understanding of how trauma was affecting veterans.
Yeah.
And the treatments that were available were often ineffective and sometimes even harmful.
It's hard to believe, right,
It is.
that it wasn't until 1980 that PTSD was officially recognized as a diagnosis in the DSM.
Right.
So before that, veterans were often misdiagnosed with things like alcoholism or depression without really addressing that root cause of their struggles.
And that must have been incredibly frustrating, both for the veterans and for the clinicians that were actually trying to help them.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like, if you're not even acknowledging the problem, how can you possibly treat it?
Right. So it makes Dr. Kolk's work all the more significant, right?
Oh, absolutely.
He was a real pioneer in bringing this issue of trauma to the forefront of the medical community's awareness.
Yeah, and his work is still so relevant today
It is.
because it challenges us to really move beyond just treating those symptoms and to really understand those underlying mechanisms of trauma and its impact on the brain, on the body, on the whole person.
And speaking of understanding the brain, he conducted some really fascinating brain imaging studies with trauma survivors, including the one where he compared the brain scans of Stan and Utah.
Right. The couple who had both been in that horrific car accident.
Yeah.
It really gave this visual, this concrete evidence of how trauma can affect the brain in these totally different ways.
So just to remind our listeners, Stan, who was reliving the trauma through flashbacks, showed that intense activity in his amygdala, so that fear center of the brain. It's like his brain was essentially stuck in that fight or flight mode even all those years after the accident.
Exactly. It's like his brain was constantly on high alert.
While Uda, who had dissociated from the experience, actually showed decreased activity in her brain overall.
Yeah. It was like her brain had basically gone into this shutdown mode to protect itself from being completely overwhelmed.
That's incredible. The same event, but two completely different ways the brain responded.
It is. And I think it just shows, how unique each person's experience of trauma can be.
It really highlights the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to healing.
Absolutely. And that's where, Dr. Kolk's emphasis on really understanding that individual's experience and tailoring the treatment accordingly becomes so important.
Now, he also talks a lot about the importance of understanding how trauma affects the brain's ability to regulate emotions and impulses. And he uses this concept of top-down versus bottom-up regulation.
Yes.
Can you break that down for our listener?
Okay. So top-down regulation, think about it as strengthening that prefrontal cortex.
So the thinking part of the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it can have more control over the amygdala, the emotional brain. So things like mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy can help with that.
So it's almost like training your mind to be more in control of those emotional responses.
Right, exactly. It's like building up that mental muscle.
Then you have that bottom-up regulation, which focuses on calming the nervous system.
Yes. And this is where those body-centered approaches come in, like breath work or yoga, somatic experiencing. It's really about working directly with that body's stress response system.
And finding that balance between the two approaches, right?
Yeah.
It's key to regaining that sense of safety and control after trauma.
It's like giving your brain and your body the tools they need to really work together.
To heal. Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive into trauma and the brain. Trauma is obviously this complex and multifaceted issue, and its impact can be far-reaching. But I think one of the most important takeaways here is that healing is possible.
It is.
And with increased awareness, understanding, and that right support, it's possible to move towards healing and to reclaim a sense of wholeness and well-being.
Absolutely. And I would just encourage our listener to continue exploring these ideas,
Yeah.
to seek out the resources and support that feel right for them. There's a whole world of knowledge and healing practices out there.
And it's really about finding what works best for you.
It is, yeah. It's an empowering journey.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive. Your expertise has been invaluable.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listener, as you continue your own exploration of trauma and the brain, consider this. If trauma rewires the brain to prioritize survival over feeling and connection, how can we, as individuals and as a society, create environments that actually foster healing and resilience rather than re-traumatization?
It's a really powerful question.
It is. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.